It's kind of futile trying to rank the greatest players of all time in Test cricket because Test cricket has changed so much, not just from 1877 to now, but even from 1877 to 1900 and then to 1930, the post-war period, the 80s, the 2000s, and even from then to now. So it's kind of a ridiculous idea, especially when you consider that we're trying to assess players based on completely different skill sets. So that's not just like things like pitches and team situations and composition like that, but as basic as the difference between a batsman and a bowler. You know, they are two completely different sports. And then that's complicated even more by fielding skills. How do you consider those sort of things? But I will give it an attempt anyway, and I have put some thought into this. The first match was played between Australia and England, so we're going to go through teams in order of which they were introduced to Test cricket. And Australia is probably the easiest on the entire list. Not because they've had a lack of legends, obviously, but because Don Bradman exists, and he averaged 99.94, which is probably about enough to say there. Bradman was dismissed in tests 70 times and made 2900s. Of those 2900s, 12 were double centuries and 2 were triple centuries. There's really not much more to say there. I mean, I'll add Keith Miller and Shane Warne as honourable mentions, but frankly, it was never going to be anyone else. Now, England, conversely, is a lot more difficult to pick. And I weighed up a whole bunch of different options, all of them batsmen. But I think, and this might be recency bias in the fact that I've actually seen him play like his whole career, but Joe Root has to be the pick for me. He's only behind Sachin in terms of test runs amongst all cricketers. And though he has played his career at the start and at the end, presuming we're closer to the end than the beginning, which I think is safe, with other very good batsmen in his team, there was a very long period where he was England's only good batsman. He probably never had the peaks of Smith or Kohli, but he does have the consistency and some mammoth years as well. So he's had 5 years where he scored over 1,000 test runs and 2 years where he scored over 1,500. Extremely honourable mentions go to Jack Hobbs, Len Hutton, Wally Hammond, and Herbert Sutcliffe, who I always group together because they're very handy to just all put together on a Sporkle quiz. Jared Kimber actually ranks all of them higher than Root in his recent ranking of Test batsmen, but it is generally agreed that Hobbs of those four is the greatest. Hobbs played for 22 years, sandwiching the Great War, and by the time of his retirement, he was so far ahead of everyone else who'd ever played Test cricket in terms of run aggregates that it's scary. Although Sutcliffe was already on the charge and Bradman had already hit his 334, so people were coming for him. Jacques Kallis was a pretty dull batsman, and his relatively one-paced, measured style hardly drove a lot of excitement with anyone, but he scored 13,000 test runs and hit 45 test centuries, so it's also inarguable. There are only 4 South African batsmen who have even half of the amount of runs that Jacques Kallis scored, and he scored basically everywhere, apart from a relatively mediocre record in England. And that's before you even consider the nearly 300 test wickets. Incredibly enough, he actually started his career really slowly with the bat, first getting his batting average over 30 in his 20th test match. For close to 2 decades, Kallis was not just one of the most calculating run machines ever created, but also one of the best fifth bowlers in the world. South Africa also have a long list of honourable mentions. Steyn is arguably the greatest strike bowler of the 21st century, and Pollock, although probably a tiny step back from Steyn, Rabada and Donald purely as a bowler, also averaged over 30 with the bat. So you can't discount that sort of all-round ability. The West Indies, again, are an easy choice, as Garfield Sobers is not just the greatest player they've ever produced, but perhaps the only player with a decent claim to being the greatest cricketer of all time apart from Don Bradman. Sobers retired after 20 years with the most runs in Test cricket. He was the first man to reach 8,000 runs. He retired with the highest ever Test score at the time of 365, and with one of the highest averages in history. And he was only behind Bradman in terms of centuries. He also wasn't just bashing around poor teams. His record against the worst teams of his era actually brought his average down. And it's not just the batting, of course, which separates Sobers even from Callis amongst the greats. It's that Sobers was a genuine frontline bowler who bowled grunt overs. He bowled over 20,000 deliveries in Test cricket, which is more than Steyn, Lilly, Willis and Marshall, and on a per match basis, he bowled more deliveries than Jimmy Anderson, Kapil Dev, Dale Steyn, Wasim Akram, and about twice as many per test as Jacques Kallis. When he retired, he had the 7th most wickets of anyone in the nearly 100-year-old history of Test cricket. And whilst the bowling average doesn't stand out, this is largely due to the sheer amount of bulk spin overs he was bowling. It's been contended that his bowling average, when he was actually bowling pace, was better, and certainly his record as an opening bowler is pretty decent. Sobers was voted as one of Wisden's 5 cricketers of the 20th century. 100% of the judges on the 100-person panel voted for Bradman in their 5, and 90% voted for Sobers. The next highest ranked player was Jack Hobbs on 30%. Most of the panel felt that requiring them to vote for Bradman and Sobers' inclusion in the list was pointless, because those two were obviously always going to be selected. That's the sort of quality we're talking about here. The Wisden panel considered Sobers closer to Bradman than any other player was close to Sobers. Now, there are so many great West Indies players to have as honourable mentions, but I'll keep it concise. Richards and Lara as Test batters are the only guys who you could reasonably argue are above Sobers purely as batsmen. Maybe George Headley as well. And of the many great West Indies bowlers, it's hard to go past Ambrose and Marshall. New Zealand have 2 clear standout options, but really they have one clear standout. Richard Hadley is simply one of the greatest bowlers of all time, and spent most of his career single-handedly carrying the New Zealand attack. In matches featuring Hadley, New Zealand took 1,207 wickets. Hadley himself took over a third of these wickets, 431, at an average of 22.3. Every other bowler combined in those tests took 776 wickets at 37, which is a difference in average of 15. If my maths is correct. Only one teammate in Hadley's entire career averaged under 30 alongside him, Richard Collinge, and they only played together for 13 tests. Hadley was outstanding against every single team, but especially Australia and the West Indies. Not only New Zealand's biggest rival in Australia, but also the West Indies, who were the greatest team of the era. The team he fared worst against was Pakistan, and even still, he averaged over 4 wickets per match and averaged 28. Now, Hadley wasn't really a proper all-rounder at Test level like people would contend, and certainly he is grouped alongside Ian Botham, Imran Khan and Kapil Dev as the 4 great all-rounders of the era. However, I contend that he wasn't really an all-rounder because neither of his Test tons were particularly notable performances. Firstly, against the West Indies, he was playing against a side who was so convinced that the Kiwi umpires were cheating that they'd basically given up on the match and were handing him the century. And his second Test ton came against a terrible Sri Lankan bowling attack, where Arjuna Ranatunga bowled over 20 overs. But that said, he was clearly a very, very good number 8 batsman and a decent number 7, and at first class level, undoubtedly an all-rounder. You can't mention Richard Hadley without mentioning that he scored 15 50s and 3,000 Test runs. The obvious honourable mention is Kane Williamson, followed closely by Cairns and Crowe, and I also think that Dan Vettori, just because of the role he played, deserves an honourable mention. Now, I don't think that India is quite as obvious as it may seem, and I have made a video in the past about how Kapil Dev's legacy could potentially lead people to thinking he's greater than Tendulkar. But the reality is that Sachin Tendulkar is the greatest Indian Test cricketer of all time. Sachin's staggering 24-year career saw him as genuinely one of the best players in the world for 17 of them maybe, and in particular between 1993 and 2010. Sachin never had quite the insane Test peaks of Ponting and Lara, who he was naturally compared to through most of his career. But he ultimately rose above them on the basis of his longevity and the sheer aggregate of his output. And if Root doesn't break his run record, then it's quite possible, given the way that Test cricket's going, that nobody ever will. Sachin did it against every team, especially the great Australian side of the era, who he averaged 55 against and 53 against in Australia. His weakest output was against South Africa and Pakistan, which would be more notable if not for the fact that his version of weak output is only relative, given he averaged 42 against both. Like many players of his era, Sachin does leave himself open to accusations of bullying Zimbabwe and Bangladesh, which he no doubt did, averaging nearly 100 against those combined, with 8 of his Test tons coming against Bangladesh and Zimbabwe. But again, there is no weakness in his record, so it's pretty moot. India's honourable mentions are also pretty obvious. Sunil Gavaskar was the little master before Sachin was the little master. Though, as a side note, I actually found out that Hanif Muhammad was called the little master before even Gavaskar was. Gavaskar's angry uncle act in the commentary box probably distracts from the fact that he was genuinely one of the greatest players in history, and was the first player to reach 10,000 Test runs, which is a staggering achievement. And obviously, Kapil Dev is the other honourable mention, whose legacy on the game as a player and as a captain is felt so strongly even today that it's actually quite hard to quantify. And just beyond that, he was an outstanding player who is the greatest pace bowler that India has ever produced, though Jasprit Bumrah makes that harder to say every passing year, and hit 9,000 international runs. And obviously Rahul Dravid was alongside Sachin for most of the best years of his career, and there's not much to separate them for large stretches of their careers. Pakistan is another very easy choice. Imran Khan does not just have a claim to being Pakistan's greatest ever player, but many would argue that he is the only legitimate challenge to Sobha's status as the greatest all-rounder in cricket history. Starting with the obvious, Imran Khan is one of the greatest pace bowlers in history. The career record is already outstanding, but it sort of hides a slow start to his career, where he averaged over 35 for his first 50 wickets, and a late career decline where he averaged almost 38 in his last 14 Test matches. All of which is sort of to be expected when you play for over 2 decades before the advent of sports science. But his best period as a bowler was between 1981 and 1988, where he took 206 wickets at 17.2 with 15 5-wicket hauls. Much of this period coincided with his best period with the bat as well, from 1982 until his retirement in 1992, where he hit 2,500 runs at over 50 with 5 centuries. Now, the obvious caveats on his batting are that he had an extraordinary number of not-outs in this period, and was batting mostly at the easiest batting positions of 6, 7 and 8. And that he, as a batsman, didn't really have the ability to take games away from the opposition. But he averaged 50 with the bat for a decade. Honourable mention has to go to Wasim Akram, who is probably the only Pakistan bowler who can challenge Imran purely on bowling. More consistently great over the course of his career from start to finish, but he never had a ridiculous spell like Imran did through the 80s. And Javed Miandad probably retains the title of the greatest Pakistan Test batsman, so is also a potential mention, but it's clearly Imran. Continuing on the stretch of easy answers, Muttiah Muralitharan took 800 Test wickets, so I don't think there's much more that needs to be said. Sri Lanka's team through the 2000s had a number of great batsmen, but so did every team in the 2000s, even Zimbabwe, as we'll get to later. No other team has ever had a bowler like Murali. He was entirely unique and was Sri Lanka's trump card through their greatest era. Now, the big drawbacks on Murali are that he bullied Zimbabwe and Bangladesh, like a lot of players of the era did. The more significant drawback on Murali is that his records in Australia is terrible, and it's pretty bad in India too. Neither of which are particularly unusual for touring spinners in those countries and against those batting lineups of the era, but they are undoubtedly a stain on the record of the all-time leading wicket taker. Regardless, Sri Lanka's greatest player is clearly Murali. The obvious honourable mention is Kumar Sangakkara. Despite what his own father might tell you, Sanga's career was outstanding, and he's their highest ever run scorer, their only player to average over 50, which actually astonished me, because I, off the top of my head, thought Mahela also averaged over 50. And Sangakkara averaged well over 50 at that. Maybe the easiest answer on this entire list is Andy Flower for Zimbabwe. Flower, usually as wicketkeeper and sometimes as captain for his team, stood tall as one of the greatest batsmen of his era, with a career record only diminished by its relative briefness compared to the other greats of his era. Though this is only due to his country's relatively fewer tests played, and obviously his premature retirement from international cricket due to his and Henry Alonga's protests of Robert Mugabe. There are a few players you could also have as honourable mentions. Honourable mentions for Zimbabwe, but Heath Streak stands above all else, as he was Zimbabwe's greatest ever pace bowler by a very large margin. Even still, he has over 3 times as many wickets as any other Zimbabwean pacer, and he also remains Zimbabwe's 7th highest run scorer, though his test batting was never quite as strong as his ODI batting was. For Bangladesh, there's an argument that Shakib Al Hasan is Bangladesh's greatest ever test batsman and their greatest ever test bowler, and though it's easier to argue the latter than the former, Shakib is overall undoubtedly the greatest test cricketer they have ever produced. And he is one of the extremely rare players who would make their country's test team based purely on either skill, which is something you can't even really say about Kallis or perhaps even Sobers. He's Bangladesh's 4th highest run scorer and their top wicket taker, and probably their only true international cricket superstar. Shakib's reputation is obviously a little bit fraught by now due to on-field and especially off-field factors, but on purely cricket terms, there's no contest here. With the 2 newest teams, this is actually quite a difficult answer to give, but having watched every Ireland test, I think there are only 2 options, and I've gone with Andy McBride, who has at times in his test career struggled with his main skill, which is spin bowling, averaging a tick over 40, but he's actually been by far Ireland's most consistent batsman down the order, time and time again arresting momentum and saving the innings after an inevitable top order collapse. And his bowling has been super important to Ireland. Andy McBride has been named player of the match in 2 of Ireland's 3 test victories so far. On the first occasion, taking 7 wickets for the match and scoring 83 runs against Zimbabwe in Belfast, and on the second occasion, making a 90 not out and taking 4 for in the match away against Zimbabwe in Bulawayo. The only other option for Ireland would be Mark Adair, who has consistently proven a very good opening bowling option, who's difficult to navigate early for batsmen, and his batting again has repeatedly saved Ireland after top order collapses, usually in partnership with Andy McBride. Adair was the player of the match in Ireland's other test match victory away in the UAE against Afghanistan, taking 8 for 95 for the match. It's quite difficult for Afghanistan, given they have a small sample and a couple of batsmen with good records, but I've gone for the safest option of Rashid Khan. Rashid Khan has taken 45 test wickets in just 6 matches and is by far their leading wicket taker at this early stage of their history. He already has 2 Player of the Match awards and 3 10-wicket hauls. The other players that I were weighing up was Ramad Shah and Hasmatullah Shahidi, but I had to go with Rashid Khan in the end. Inevitably, some people will disagree, so I suppose the hate comments go down there. But let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. I suppose is all I have to say there.